All right, great. Well, hello everyone. My name is Tom Adams, and I'm thrilled to be moderating a session on future of human rights, on regulation, on smarter ways to understand human rights due diligence with three of my absolute favorite people in the sector, three people I've learned a huge amount from and thoroughly enjoy working with. I will introduce them all in a minute after I've done a little bit of housekeeping. It would be lovely for those of you who are joining if we can know a little bit about who you are. So would love to ask that if you could say your name and introduce yourself, your company, and where you're dialing in from in the chat box as you arrive. Talking about the chat box, some wider housekeeping. Please can you use the Q&A box or raise your hand to share any questions you may have throughout this session. We'll take questions along the way. So it's not going to be like, we'll wait till right to the end and then do all the questions, but we'd love to have questions as they come in. And my colleague Jaslene will pop up every so often with interesting questions for the panel. And then to say we are recording this webinar and we will send a link to it afterwards. Before I introduce my amazing panelists, a little on 60 decibels, I assume most people will know who we are, but we're a global social performance measurement and human rights due diligence company working in over 90 countries now, helping organizations to understand their impact or look at their human rights risks through speaking directly to the people who are or are not impacted by all our work. That means in beneficiaries, customers, suppliers, employees, and we do that through mostly phone-based person-to-person surveys. Right then, over to the session itself. We're going to cover a few things here. We're going to introduce all the panelists in a second, and I'm going to ask them a bit about their experience in sustainability. We are going to inevitably touch on regulations and the regulatory environment, looking at CSDDD and the omnibus. But really, we want to talk more broadly than just regulation. We want to talk about smarter due diligence, how it actually happens, what are our obligations, what can we do, how can companies improve, what are companies such as the ones I've got with me today doing to look at this. We're going to look at some of the challenges, areas for potential innovation in this area, and then we want to look out to the future. How will things change over the medium to longer term? Right, so I'd love now to introduce my three panelists. I've got Jeff Morgan, Sustainability Advisor with the Sucden Group, Inge Jacobs, who heads up Sustainability at Mars Food, particularly with Ben's Original, and Mollie Liesner, who works on the Sustainability and Procurement team at Unilever. I might ask guys by asking you about your experience in sustainability, particularly what attracted you to work in this area in the first place, maybe how things have changed as you've been working in this area, and then thinking about the current state of sustainability and what's most urgent, what's on your mind most, what's top of mind for you guys at the moment. Jeff, I'm going to kick it off with you, so I'd love to hear about that.
All right, thanks, Tom. Good morning, everyone. It's very nice to participate in this panel. I think it'll be of interest to everyone. Just a quick word on myself. I work for Sucden, the trading group. We're based in Paris. We're an international trade house, and we handle sugar, coffee, and cocoa. I work on the cocoa sustainability team, and I think the primary focus I have is, along with the team, how do we translate these upcoming regulatory requirements, and as well as our customer interests, into sustainability programs in the field. My personal journey with sustainability began when I worked with Mars Incorporated prior to joining Sucden in 2019. In Mars, we got very concerned about the future reliability of cocoa supplies in the mid-1990s, especially following on from a major disease outbreak in Brazil. We joined with a group of about 8 companies to try and look at this reliability of supply issue. And we really then began talking about the 3 pillars of sustainability and came to call this effort a sustainable cocoa effort. Our first major program was a joint program with USAID back in their heyday in West Africa. It was a regional program in West Africa. Since then, we've learned quite a bit. And since that time, I've been focused primarily on child labor and other human rights issues. And I think top of mind for me and our team right now is understanding the regulatory expectations that are coming upon us and how we can put human rights due diligence in place in a credible and efficient manner. So that's little bit about me, Tom.
Thank you so much, Jeff. Inga, over to you.
Yeah, I'm Inge Jacobs. I'm currently based here in Chicago, originally from Belgium. My journey in sustainability started long before I joined Mars, about 10 years ago. I have an educational background in law and human rights and did my master's in human rights in the year 2000 when sustainability was very much a focus of NGOs. I feel like we were all going out to do this master's because we wanted to work in a not-for-profit sector and work on human rights. I feel like over time companies have joined that train and came on board as well, which has been great because that's where we can drive real impact. I started working in not-for-profit organizations for about 15 years in Africa and South America before joining Mars in Côte d'Ivoire in West Africa. And I started as the senior manager, human rights and social impact in the Mars Cocoa team for about 8 years, where I worked very, very closely with Jeff for many years. So it's always good to be connected with Jeff. Today, I'm the global sustainable sourcing lead for the food and nutrition segment at Mars, which is a different business unit. And we're focusing not on chocolate or cocoa, but now I'm focusing more on rice and tomatoes, herbs and spices, palm, other raw materials. Always very much focusing on sustainable sourcing and working very closely with our procurement teams to really embed sustainability in our buying processes and commercial systems. Just like our buyers look at cost, quality, resilience of the supply chains, we want them to also embed sustainability in those decisions that they make. And it's very different. It can range from working with our suppliers on implementing climate smart practices in our rice supply chains to conducting HRDD processes, just like Jeff mentioned as well. And one last thing I'll say is that my focus and my passion, because now I'm working both on healthy planet and thriving people, my passion is still on the people elements of sustainability, which means human rights, gender, child protection, community development, and so on. Yeah, that's a bit about me.
So much, Inga. Mollie.
Excellent. So thanks so much, Tom, and to the 60 Decibels team for inviting me along today. My name's Mollie, and I currently work at Unilever, which is the company that sells you Dove deodorant. We used to sell you Magnum ice creams, but the ice cream business is currently separating, which is very sad. And we also sell you everything from Knorr soup to Hellmann's. So we are a very large, very diverse company. My role here is in the procurement sustainability team, which means I help any of our supply chain initiatives to measure the work that they're doing. So I'm in the measurement side rather than the implementation side of things. I came to Unilever with an evaluation and measurement and reporting background. I started my career doing physical surveys on plastic chairs under trees in northern Nigeria a very long time ago. I remember the first time I managed an SMS or a message survey in Mombasa, also a very long time ago. So come very far in the time that I've been involved in terms of how we collect data. And I'm a big proponent of doing things in an effective way and also doing things in a way that includes the voices of beneficiaries. So very much excited about the work that we'll be discussing today.
Tremendous. Thank you so much, Mollie. And it is such a pleasure to be with you three today. I've collectively learned so much from you all over the last few years of working together. I think if there's one thing, I mean, I wouldn't have expected it 2 years ago, but I have been spent more time reading things around EU regulation than I possibly could have thought I would do in the last 2 years. And I suppose it's almost inevitable that we end up a conversation around how we get smarter at due diligence by talking about some of the changes that are coming around from the regulation. But I'd love to hear from you, Jeff and Inge, around your views on the emerging human rights due diligence regulations, the opportunities that they might bring about, but also some of the concerns around the regulation and how it's affecting your work at the moment. So Inge, I'd love to start with you if that's possible.
Yeah, sure. I want to start by saying, as a sustainability expert, I want to say regulations are my friend. They help us level the playing field, and they help us push for higher transparency in supply chain. So although it might be cumbersome and it's difficult and complex to comply, I do think they're important in the push towards more transparency and sustainability. And we all know that the regulatory tides have been ebbing and flowing lately. And they, of course, help. But I think in terms of how we look at it, we're not doing what we do for the sake of the regulation. We know investing in sustainability will help us attract and maintain great talent in our teams. People want to work with Mars because they hear what we're doing on sustainability and therefore also on HRDD. We know it will help us be a trusted company in the eyes of our consumers and customers. It builds us more resilient supply chains, really, and gives us access to quality raw materials. And it also helps us support the farmers in our supply chain. So I feel like regulations, there's a lot of talk around it. It does help us, and it does drive what we need from our supply chains. And I think things will ebb and flow, but in the end, there's like a strong current moving us forward. So yeah, that's what I would like to share on this question.
And Jeff, there are one or two people I've noticed on the chat that I've spoken to a considerable amount about these regulations over the past year, but I think I've probably spoken to you about it more than anyone. So I know you've been thinking very carefully about it. What are your feelings about where things are but what this has meant for those trying to respond to the regulations and try and think about the regulations and ultimately do higher quality sustainable work and understand their supply chains in more detail?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. And I'll echo a number of things I think that Inge's touched on. I think those of us that are close to the due diligence regulation understand that we're at a point in time where we don't know where this is going to land. We hear rumors almost every day about whether it'll be simplified or whether it'll be strengthened. We just don't know. And it may take another 6 months before we do know. I think what's important, though, is, and in echoing Inge, is at Sucden, we recognize the need, especially for human rights due diligence, to be in place in our supply chain. Now, it is challenging, but we don't want, and we know our customers certainly don't want, to have child labor in the supply chain. And we certainly don't want adult workers in a position where they are unable to leave their work or they feel threatened by their work, these indicators of forced labor. So we're working with the idea that regulations or not, we're going to put due diligence in the field. Now that brings us to your question around the challenge. I think when we look at complex agricultural supply chains like cocoa or coffee, various other commodities, we're handling, hundreds of thousands of farmers. For Sucden, we purchase cocoa, I would say, conservatively from close to 200,000 farming families every year. So how do we put a credible, meaningful due diligence system in place within that kind of supply chain? That we're getting some ideas, but it's not that straightforward. So that's our challenge. Regardless of what happens now with the due diligence regulations, we're going to continue down this path and really work towards finding appropriate methodologies to put due diligence in place.
If you could, we talked previously, Jeff, about things being murky with the changes. In some ways, what I believe I've heard from you, but I don't want to, is that some certainty is what would be the most important thing, so that companies can get on with knowing what they should be doing vis-a-vis these regulations.
Well, certainty is always important. And I was going to mention this later, but I can mention it now. I think one of the concerns with the way we see the due diligence regulation crafted at this point is the short time frame that is suggested for implementation. I think, again, taking into account, it's one thing if your supply chain is factory based, where you have a very concentrated point, geographical point where goods are made. That's not the case with agriculture. It's not the case with agricultural commodities, especially in West Africa, very broad geographies. So I do think we need to look more realistically at the time frame that's required to put these systems in place.
Okay, great.
Can I add to
Yeah,
that? You mentioned certainty. I would add clarity is something also that would be interesting or important. Clarity in what the expectation. Like we all know what we have to do, but we need clarity in what is it exactly that we need to report on, or that we need to show, or how to show that. And it's also we also need an acknowledgement of the complexity of our supply chains. Jeff mentioned that earlier. It's the complexity of the supply chains. It's the complexity of certain topics that we're trying to uncover. It's not so easy to uncover human rights risks. These are often not so obvious or identifiable, even when you go on a site visit or a field visit. And oftentimes, certain practices are very ingrained into social norms and traditional forms of ways of life. So acknowledging that somehow will also be really, really critical, because otherwise it's going to make our lives way more hard, I think.
Yeah, I mean, from some of the things that I've read, often the regulation says to investigate, and the question of how and the degree to which you do it and the degree to the rigor that's involved, that is left kind of open. And we all know that. I'm going to switch to data collection in a second now, because it's a handy bridge to this. We all know that data collection can be, come in all kinds of flavors and all kinds of qualities and all kinds of rigors. And so simply, saying an aspiration to do these things is not quite the same as like being clear about how often, to what degree of standard, what sort of data is actually going to be required in these quite complicated value chains. But look, we were all working together. We've had the privilege of working with you guys for way longer than when the regulations came around, which I think actually double underlines that you guys have been leading on this and wanting to have better information around these areas before regulation was being pushed forward. I'd love to switch to actually data and how we get better data and how we learn more, as you said, Inge, about some of these complicated supply chains and very complicated issues. It's not like you can easily just turn up somewhere and wave a magic wand and say, hey, we now know the degree of forced labor in a very complicated, fragmented supply chain. So we have been working with you all, but I'm also very, very keen, and double underline this, that I'd love to know about stories from your work with other people as well, in terms of how you're collecting data. But I'd love to turn to the idea of, okay, well, what are, in terms of the real opportunities, but also challenges of getting better information on these topics, and what you guys specifically have been doing to try and improve the information you have so that you can better understand your supply chains and better respond to some of those risks. So Mollie, as you described, Unilever, a truly giant company with its hands in supply chains pretty much everywhere. So a gargantuan task. How does an organization like Unilever start to think about improving the information it gets on human rights risks through its supply chains? And I'd love to know any specific pieces of work you're doing that are really working so far. What's been good about them? What have you learned from them, and how has the organization responded to it?
Yes, so that complexity and that scale is in some ways the big theme in designing and coming up with what we do. Unilever has its mandatory human rights due diligence system already up and running, but there was a big ambition within Unilever to go further and to understand what the quality of the jobs is or are at the suppliers that provide Unilever with the products we buy. So we wanted to go beyond an audit of systems and processes to understand how good the jobs are for the workers who are there. This is not a difficult thing to do, right? People have been measuring job quality for a really long time. We've got some decent frameworks in place. And we've even started to do it remotely rather than in person. So in theory, we're not trying to sort of solve a really crazy neurological problem here, but the challenge is that we need to do that whilst also operating within a procurement system where we are buying competitively from different suppliers, whether we're buying aerosol cans or, you know, Magnum sticks. We have those types of relationships that are commercial, that vary in both in sense of the amount of time we have worked with those suppliers. But there's also the very real issue of scale. We can't do this with 300 people. That isn't really a drop in the ocean for Unilever in terms of the people working at the factories we purchase things from. So the challenge really was to do what is actually not too difficult at scale and within a commercial relationship. And what we found out through various different methods of data collection is that it is possible. That's the main finding. It is possible to do it. You can work with suppliers and they can say, yes, we are happy for you to do this survey, and you can get interesting data. So it is possible. However, to do that, you have to start asking questions and doing surveys in a way that is at odds with the topic. So speaking about what is a migrant, who identifies as a migrant, their ideas and their concept of harassment, and whether or not they or someone else has been harassed, doing that over text message is really hard, and in some ways some people would say completely redundant, because you won't get the information you need. So that's the dichotomy. We are reduced to very remote survey data collection in order to do things at scale and within commercial relationships. But then we've got these issues about, okay, is that actually the right way to collect information on these types of changes? And what we found is, I think you have to compromise. So we have collected data from about 10,000 workers over the last year through in-person surveys, through phone calls, and through text messages, like SMSs, as well as through WhatsApp. And I think the truth of it is that those methods are never going to reach the most marginalized. So people who have handed over their passport, who don't live in their community, who don't have a phone, these methods are not going to reach those very marginalized people in general. But they will reach the masses. And something that was really important for us was to make sure that we were going to be hearing from women and from men. And actually, if you put certain things in place, you can, and we have. So I feel like we've got a good gender balance, a good age balance, in some ways a good ethnicity balance through these survey methods, but I think it won't ever be the bottom of your pyramid. You're really, really marginalized and vulnerable people. I think to reach them, more old-fashioned survey and data collection methods are still required.
Mollie, can you say anything, just building on that, about, because I think that one of the things that I think people struggle with a little bit is that data seems to be everywhere, and everyone's got a data solution, and everyone says, and I agree with you entirely, by the way, that we can get this kind of data. Like it's actually quite a lot of the art of this is the operationalization of it. How is it done in a sustainable, scalable, cost-effective way with all the commercial pressures you're talking about? But before we get back to that again, I might ask Jeff about some of these things too. What is the data that you specifically want? Like what format do you want it in? What do you want to be able to report in an ideal world about, say, the quality of
Of
jobs
jobs.
in a workplace
Yeah.
in a factory that you're sourcing from. What would you like to say about that? What data would help you demonstrate that?
So a company like Unilever is made up mostly of marketing people and procurement people, both of who love quantitative data. So as a company, we bow to the altar of numbers. So there's a number. People don't want anything that looks wishy-washy. They want to put a number on things. However, at the same time, the new reporting requirements coming in through the EU are asking for qualitative stories, explanations, and understandings of exactly what's going on, bringing things to life. So really, we need both. We need to be able to understand things at a quantitative nature, whether it is, okay, how many of the workers trust a grievance mechanism, or how many of the workers have been trained within the last year. So we need that kind of information at the same time as also being able to tell a story that shows the causality. So a certain worker didn't used to receive what they wanted because of certain changes, now they do. So I think, unfortunately, Unilever and similar companies, we want everything everywhere all at once. And it's really hard to just pick one kind of data because we have a lot of stakeholders internally and externally.
Thank you so much, Mollie. Jeff, turning to you now, we've spoken several times around, okay, what we'll need for the future is again, this idea of a scalable, repeatable, affordable way of collecting better data on topics like child labour and forced labour, so that you can actually get a better sense of risk. And that to my mind has not been built yet. There isn't a off-the-shelf solution that someone can turn up to at Sucden and say, "Great news, Jeff. I can get you this data across your supply chain around the degree of forced labour occurring in all the different parts of that supply chain." And that's so there are people trying to build that, and you've been very thoughtful about how you're approached thinking about how to build that. Can you talk a bit about how Sucden has been approaching getting better information on these topics, and what you're learning in the various ways in which you're trying to improve the risk information you get at a scalable, sustainable way? And again, touching maybe on Mollie on some of the commercial pressures that are involved in doing that too.
Yeah, that's a good question, Tom. What we've done in terms of trying to get look at our human rights data collection requirements is we started by looking at the work we're doing on child labor monitoring, and based on a lot of support from our major customers, we're able to look at more specific, well-defined supply chains. So a group of farmers who's selling to a co-op in Cote d'Ivoire or in Ghana, where we actually have farmer lists. We know who those farmers are. We're actually able to send trained enumerators to those households and ask questions to determine if children are going to school, are the children working, and then we're able to determine if the children might be working in hazardous labor. Then we're able to remediate that through various methods. But that's all based on face-to-face interviews. And I think what we've come to realize is, while that's workable in a defined customer supply chain, it is not going to be scalable across the totality of our supply chain, which is a lot of cocoa coming from ill-defined areas. But we're also then, when you look at forced labor versus child labor, it's much more rare, but it's also a more sensitive topic. So we started to consider how can we do this without having trained enumerators go to all these workplaces, because we don't see that as a scalable option. So that's when we started working with 60 Decibels, and we carried out, as you'll recall, I thought a really insightful bit of work in Cote d'Ivoire, where we took a sample of two groups, and we compared data collected by telephone interviews with data collected by in-person interviews. And what we found in comparing those results is we think there's a real opportunity to build on cell phone type of interviews. And so we're going to continue that work in another major origin, in a collaborative effort with 60 Decibels, Free the Slaves, a major NGO, Wageningen University. So we're excited to explore just how can we collect usable data, usable information. And I want to build a little bit on Mollie's point that collecting forced labor information is much more difficult. When we're talking to families about children, families are typically very interested in making sure their kids are in school. And when we say, this kind of work can be hazardous, they're very willing, for most part, to make a change. What we've been finding when it comes to forced labor, and Inge mentioned this, there's very ingrained practices that have been going on for decades, where just in a recent visit to one of the major West African regions, we found a lack of knowledge about just basic indicators of forced labor. People didn't realize that people should be paid regularly, that they should have a contract, at least a witness verbal contract, because these are not standard practices. So it's going to be a challenge to not only collect the data, but then to change these ingrained practices. But it just underscores the need. We're going to have to be thoughtful and more innovative as we do that.
I want to come back to innovation in a second. I think, Inge, I also want to ask you this question, but Jocelyn, have we got at this stage any questions from anyone who's been asking on the chat?
We do. I think data excites everyone. So we have a bit of a conversation going around ecosystem level data sources and data sharing, and folks are curious to hear about how companies are collaborating to make sure human rights due diligence is not siloed, but more of a shared activity. So yeah, anybody who'd like to take it up?
Inge, why don't you have a crack at that question? Because I was actually going to come to you with a question on collaboration in a minute, so that seems like perfect timing.
Great. First of all, I want to kick off the answer to this question by saying, one of the challenges we are facing constantly is that we are apparently all pursuing perfection over progress, and we're operating in such contexts where we'll never have 100% accurate data, or we will never be able to predict 100% of all the risks that exist in supply chain. So I feel that's one that's important to keep in mind, because that's also why we need to look for tools and approaches that allow us to have enough visibility and understanding of the risks in our supply chains, and that allow us to address those risks. And that's also where collaboration comes in, where we can use each other's data or use reports from analysis that others have done. It is a difficult one because the topic is very sensitive. Human rights is very sensitive as a topic. And we are doing these surveys with you now in our rice supply, with 60 Decibels in our rice supply chain in India, Pakistan, and Thailand, which is leading to great analysis and great insights. We're working very intensely internally to try to see, okay, can we publish these reports? Because we believe they might be helpful to our suppliers, be helpful to other partners or companies that are working in the rice supply chain in those countries to actually use that data. And even if it's not in their circumscribed supply chains, you can still get valuable insights to work in your own supply chain. So I feel in terms of collaboration, it's how do we get over that obstacle of be willing to share. And I think as part of that, there's also one other bigger challenge I see, is that when we identify or uncover human rights risks, it's often seen as oh my gosh, we uncovered a human rights risk. And obviously we don't want human rights risks in our supply chain, but I want to turn this around and almost have like a mind shift and say, hey, this is actually an opportunity to do something about it. The fact that we're uncovering it is a good thing. And how do we talk about that in a way that we are understanding our supply chains, we're building more and more robust, we have more and more robust data, we're building more and more transparency in our supply chains, which will allow us to actually focus our interventions on what we're finding. There's still a way to go on that, I think, and I feel like we've come a long way in terms of collaboration in different sectors. I was in cocoa before, and it's amazing how much the industry is actually collaborating on topics like child labor and forced labor. But there's always still that obstacle of, how much do we want to share and how much is that going to kind of be held against us,
Right.
rather than we will share because we want to do something about it. Don't hold it against us. You know what I'm saying?
Certainly. And actually, we've got, talking about collaboration, because we've got two brands here and we've got a trader, or some representative trader. How are brands and traders now starting to work together on this? Because it is a supply chain, and this is your supplier as a trader, like Jeff, working for someone like Ecom, coming through to a brand like Mars. And obviously, sometimes you have integrated supply chains as well. But what's the dynamic between brands and traders, and how are brands and traders working together to try and improve this?
I think with Unilever, there are a few cases where there's an actor who's in that kind of trader or aggregator intermediary position, and we'll work directly with them rather than with what we'd call our supplier, because they in some ways have bigger scale. They're the ones who are closest to what's happening compared to Unilever, especially in agriculture. So we're talking here a lot about companies and companies' human rights due diligence. But when you're aggregating loads of crop from thousands, 10,000s of small scale farmers, you have to work with the aggregators and the traders in order to get that scale. I think for me, the question is, are brands the right organizations to do that? Wouldn't we all do this at the moment because we need it? There's a demand and it's not being we can't get that data anywhere else. But really in the perfect world, should it be Mars and Unilever who are the ones collecting this data themselves? Would it not be better if we can get it from somewhere else, another organization that is specifically set up to do this? And that way you don't get these conflicts. But for now, yes, we do it.
Yeah, we've seen some really interesting pieces of work emerging where actually groups of traders are coming to us, and I'm sure they are to other service providers, and saying, look, actually, why don't you collect data for all of us? And there's some attractive elements to that, which is that obviously from a commercial perspective, one person collecting for multiple people is effective, but also then from a risk perspective, these are endemic risks, and people are then sharing that information around what their combined endemic risks are. So no one is sort of having that risk of saying, here's our data, and actually, Inge, you said it earlier, being jumped on as critical as saying, it's almost like a room full of people waiting to jump on you because you've actually tried to take a step forward to being towards transparency, which is definitely not what we want. On the topic of data, I want to stick with data, but again, it's to this point of like, data is having worked in data for getting on for 20 years now. Like it almost feels like it's like a yeti sometimes. It's like everyone talks about data, but it's not actually seen the specifics of it, like the actual data points and what they're useful for. Like, this is the data that I got. This is the decisions I've been making. So going back to the data you've ever gotten through looking at sustainability, is there certain things that either jump out either as the data that's been the most useful, or actually you can take it the other way, the data that's been the least useful in actually helping you make better decisions in terms of managing the due diligence or the risk in supply chains? And Mollie, I might stick with you for examples of that data that have been most useful.
Yeah, I mean, my response might not be popular. Looking beyond Unilever in general, I find that it's very rare that you collect data from these types of surveys that people didn't already know. It happens, but more often than not, you are collecting data that is validating or re-emphasizing what the extension officers already knew or what companies already knew. And sometimes that's good because it gives power to that position to say, look, we now definitely know it because this survey has been done. And so that's good. I can think of very few times where it's, a survey has brought something up that actually a company did not know about. The only time that ever happens really is when it's something a company is trying to hide. So and in that case, we need to do the survey. So specifically around human rights of workers, I think unfortunately, individual stories don't make changes. It's a bit sad, but if you can come back to a company and say, look, 70% of people who work with you say they don't have a contract. So what are you going to do about this? Rather than, oh, we've heard people say they're not happy with the contracts. So it's the hard and fast stuff. Like, do you have a contract? Yes or no? Is it in your language? Yes or no? That data is easier to action than the more nebulous concepts. But even then, as I said, very rarely will you find something that people don't already know. You're just validating something.
Thank you, Mollie.
And you're kind of quantifying it, I think, right,
Yeah.
Mollie? Because it's what you're saying. There's a lot of things that we already know, but being able to put that number helps us drive action forward, I think, and prioritize.
Yeah, and degrees of information. Do we learn about the degrees of something that might be slightly more surprising and nudge someone towards saying, actually, this is a more significant issue than we thought?
I think we have an example of that, Tom. Just echoing Mollie's point. Well, I think the usable data we found in looking at forced labor is trying to understand what are the indicators of forced labor. We got some really good advice from colleagues at Verite about 5 or 6 years ago, which is you probably don't want to go trying to look specifically for forced labor events. But if you can look for indicators, it gives you much more ability to remediate where you're finding indicators. So in some very recent work, we were surprised to find that many of the farmers in this one region that we're working in actually do hire labor. We were thinking, well, these are family farms in Cote d'Ivoire. It's not all that common for people to hire the labor. But in this area where we were at in a different country, the majority of farmers are hiring labor, and they're hiring adult labor. And then we found a significant percentage of those are actually hiring immigrant or migrant labor. So this is a pretty strong indication that the people being hired are vulnerable. That allows us to design an intervention where we start to inform people more of their rights. And again, back to the cultural issue, a lot of people aren't actually that familiar with their rights as a laborer. So I think really honing in on key indicators when it comes to forced labor is critical, and it does help you design then preventative efforts. So we're finding that to be quite useful.
Tom, if I can build on that, I think it's a big lesson learned is that on data, we were talking about data, we always want to collect 1,000 data points, but it's how do we focus on those data points that are really critical and are going to help us move the needle without collecting everything everywhere all the time. I think that for me is a really important lesson, and it's also something we did in our surveys that 60 Decibels conducted. It's like 40 questions. You can go up to 60, 70, 80, but how do you narrow it down to those 40 questions that will limit the time that you need from the beneficiary or the interviewee, and that also will give you what you need in terms of data? I think it's a difficult exercise, but it's an essential exercise.
Great. Thank you so much, guys. Justine, I'm going to ask you to pop up again. This is a new thing we're trying with Justine suddenly popping up with questions from the group.
Yes, we have a very interesting question around income measurement. And so Stephanie is curious if, this is a question for the panelists. Do you consider poverty itself as a risk? And what are solutions you're using to collect data on incomes and livelihoods of farmers, and how this links to conditions of casual or permanent farm workers?
I didn't understand the question properly, so I don't know if you can repeat it or I look for it in the chat somewhere.
I can repeat it, Inge. The question is,
No, go ahead.
yeah, the question. Okay. The question is, do you consider poverty itself to be a risk given in ag supply chains, especially with smallholder poverty can be a root or, one of the majority contributors to risks like child or forced labor?
I can answer from Unilever's perspective. So Unilever doesn't buy directly from small-scale farmers, but they do live within some of our supply chains, especially the ice cream side of the business that has separated out. Yes, poverty is a risk. It's a risk to Unilever because of what poverty is. Poverty is an indication of, for small-scale farmers, bad prices and bad yields and bad practices. Now, those things are a problem for Unilever. If yields are not good, then we won't get the products that we need. If prices are not right or if they're too low, then people will migrate out of that sector into different sectors. And practices, we need good quality goods. So from a very commercial risk perspective, that's how Unilever would see it at a commercial level. If we look at it down more at a kind of supply chain by supply chain level, the risks around child labor and forced labor and other human rights risks at a small scale farmer level, we do see a change when poverty changes, but the two are not directly correlated. We haven't seen evidence that forced labor gets better as the farmer themselves earns more. So I think one is not an indication of the other to us in our supply chains, unfortunately.
Yeah, to a recent piece of work we did, Mollie suggested that, and this might surprise people as well, that larger farms and wealthier farmers were often associated with more of these issues because they needed more labor. So actually, some of the wealthier farmers in the sample that we had collected data for had higher incidences of some of these challenges. Jeff, Inge, anything to add to that topic?
The only thing I would add is that from Mars, one of our commitments is that we want people in our supply chains to thrive, and that means human rights, poverty. But is that an easy thing to achieve? No, it's not easy to achieve. So we're still working on what does that mean in practice, and we're looking at income indicators. But it also we know it's also a root cause and a risk in our supply chain. So we're definitely trying to work on that, but we also acknowledge that it's not something we on our own can solve. There's so many other factors involved in why people are living in poverty. So we definitely want to play a part, but it's one of those things where us alone cannot solve it.
Yeah, I would echo that, Tom. I think, and it depends on the supply chain you're working in.
Yeah,
Unfortunately, in West Africa, we're dealing with a lot of small farms. Those farms are aging. Yields are going down. So, as I said, unfortunately, a lot of those farmers are not seeing real benefits from these much higher cocoa prices. Whereas if you go into some other origins where yields are higher, farms are larger, and even government policies are more lax, meaning there's a more open free market. So a higher percentage of the world price goes directly to those farmers. We can already see that many farmers are now making beyond a living income. But Inge's correct, in those other more vulnerable, more poverty-stricken regions, it's a very complex picture of government policies, farm sizes, decreasing yields. We do work on that. A number of customers that we work with, major brands, are working to improve incomes through direct payments to farmers. But it's a very complex issue. It's not just one element that you can change.
Right. These topics can get quite heavy, and so I would like to turn to opportunities as well. and 60 decibels as the company wouldn't exist if there weren't opportunities to improve the quality of data that people can get. And I think there are huge areas for potential innovation and also opportunities for better data in this. So I'm going to ask you to imagine that I was your magic data fairy that could come along and provide you with any data point that you most wanted or would be most useful to you in terms of understanding the sustainability issues or sustainability opportunities within your organizations, and what that data point would be. And then we can talk about, well, also how might that data point be brought about and made a reality. So Inge, maybe thinking about the work you do in rice, if I could generate for you at any scale or any cross regions, cross organizations, if I could magic it up from the data gods, what data point would you, or combination of data points, would you find most useful in your work if you could suddenly have them?
It's a bit of an unfair question because one data point is not fair.
Yeah, okay.
That's very little.
Yeah.
You
You
know,
have to yeah.
Yeah, what I'm most interested in is it's similar to what we have done in our recent survey that we're still, working through the insights and analyzing the results, is really around the livelihoods of the farmers. Because building on what Mollie said, if the farmers are not happy with, the prices they're getting for their rice, or they're not happy with the rice growing, they don't want their kids to grow rice in the future, we as a company will not have the rice that we need for our products. So I think if you work on the livelihoods of the farmers and understanding what their livelihood, I'm using that as a data point, but it's a bit broad. You will have noticed there's different things going under livelihood. But for me, it's that if the farmers really find that they have a business case of continuing to grow rice, they can put food on the table, they can send their kids to school, they're thriving, then I would be really happy to know that. That's the information I would like to know.
So systematically data on the degree to which farmers are thriving across your supply chain. And
yeah.
Okay. Jeff?
Yeah, I'm going to tell a quick story and come back to one question. So on the recent trip I was talking about with Lewis, one of your great researchers, we were in a community meeting and we were explaining to the farmers that were in this community meeting, a fairly large number of farmers. And we had expressed concerns about, your workers need contracts. Your workers need to be paid regularly. You can't be keeping their documents. And so one of the farmers stood up and if my recollection is correct, he was pretty senior in the community, might have been the chief. He said, well, what is it that you want us to do? And really made me think. It reminded me when you said, what's the one data point? I said, treat your workers with respect. And so we had a really good conversation around what that meant. But I think if I was only able to ask one question, I would ask farmers, if you're hiring labor, are you treating them with respect? Now, that's when you get into, do they have a contract? Are you paying them regularly? Can they leave if they want to? But I think that the reason that comes to my mind is there's going to have to be a lot of training that goes into addressing, especially forced labor issues. Farmers, from my experience, aren't automatically going to know what they have to do to treat their workers with true respect and give them the rights that they need.
Fascinating, Jeff. I'm tempted to ask a follow-up, but I will ask Mollie first about your thoughts.
I'm going to answer in the context of the work we're doing at the moment with 60 decibels, so around suppliers, manufacturing suppliers that Unilever purchases from. The sticking point, or I guess the kind of the catalyst for change, is about the people who manage and run those companies or own the companies. Their opinion has to change. So if I run a factory, unless I genuinely believe that there is value, and to me and any wider value, to treating my staff with respect, to employing people in a legal, safe, moral way, then the change will happen. And quite often that change doesn't happen. So anything is always a little bit limited. So if I could have any data point, it would be the genuine opinion of company management and ownership on workers' rights.
Fascinating. I did not expect it. This is so interesting. 3 different data points there. And also I would not have Inge, I might have predicted your one actually, but given our conversations, but it's very, very yeah. And Mollie, that gets me thinking about opportunities for collecting that data point. And Jeff, yeah, you're that's such an interesting thing, and hopefully we'll have an opportunity in the future to start building some question sets around exactly those topics, and build some data, some tools to measure those risks associated with how people are or are not treating their workers fairly and with respect. I'm conscious we're with 4 minutes from time, so I would have normally asked another question of everyone, but I want to make sure we finish on time. But before we do, any last reflections or any thoughts of I don't know, Jeff, Inge in particular. I've often talked to you about this, about where the sector will be in 10 years' time, where you might guess in terms of the sorts of quality of data, or we're still, that would be too hard a question to think about where we might be in the future. Any last thoughts before we close up?
I would say this is a journey. And I would go back to the point I made right at first, that this is going to take time. I think historically, countries who have tried to legislate human rights have found that it takes time. Once the legislation is passed, it takes time. And I just do have concerns that we don't have a realistic time frame in mind to have this done. So it's a journey, and I think in 10 years' time, we'll still be on that journey.
Yeah, and to build on Mollie's point about all the value that so many actors have to see value in doing this, right? It can't just be imposed from above and expect people to respond to it. Inge, any final thoughts from you?
Yeah, I'm quite an optimistic person, and I'm hoping, for me, I think in 10 years from now, technology will have evolved. We're going to have way more tools to get to where we want to get to, which is more transparent supply chains with easier ways to identify the risks and actually address them quickly and efficiently. So I'm hoping that technology will be on our side and that we'll know how to use it properly to get there.
I totally agree. I feel optimistic about this too, and I hope in much shorter than 10 years' time, 60 Decibels or another organization can provide you each with the 3 different types of data points you all said you would want.
Amazing.
At scale, in a repeatable way that fits with your commercial constraints as well. Like, constraints may be the wrong word, but it fits in the commercial realities of complex supply chains. Just to say thank you so much, all of you, for giving up your time to be part of this. Thank you so much for everyone who joined live, and this will also be sent as a link, as a recording, to those who showed interest and weren't able to make it. I have learned so much from the 3 of you in the time we've been working together, and hope to continue to do so over the years to come. And your thoughts and your time here were incredibly interesting and insightful. And I'm definitely going to go away and think about some of those points around which data points are ideal, because they need designing. So thank you all so much.
Thank you so
Thanks
much.
so much.
And the 60 Decibel team.
Yeah, good to be with you. Bye.
Bye.
Cheers, guys. Bye.